more time then, and I have less time now. But I'm going to be talking about, as you can see, philosophy and fate in Hellenistic astrology, a very small topic. So this is basically my presentation of how I think fate is coming into astrology and what kind of fate that might be. So we'll start, as we always do, with Greece and the classical view of philosophy in Hellenistic astrology. And that is that astrology is deriving its philosophy and cosmology primarily from Greece. So we have things like the influence of Plato in cosmology and philosophy, things like the Timaeus, as all of you are very well aware. Things like the Republic, and in particular the myth of which actually is going to become rather important for the idea of fate and astrology. And so at this point, I think I'm going to read you quickly a little section from the myth of So you may all know this material, but for some of you it may have been a while since you looked at it. So I'm going to read you the part. Basically, the situation in the myth of in the Republic is that is a soldier, and he's hit over the head and knocked unconscious. And when he comes to, he finds himself in a meadow with a whole bunch of souls who are waiting to reincarnate. And so that's the opening of the story. And so the dialogue says, when and the souls arrived, their duty was to go at once to Lachesis, one of the Moirai, the Fates. But first of all, there came a prophet who arranged them in order, and then he took from the knees of Lachesis lots, kleroi, and examples of lives, and having mounted a high pulpit, spoke as follows. Hear the word of Lachesis, the maiden daughter of necessity. Mortal souls, behold a new cycle of life and mortality. Your daimon will not be allotted to you, but you will choose your daimon. And you can think of the daimon as something like a guardian angel, similar concept. And let him who draws the first lot have the first choice, and the life which he chooses shall be his of necessity. Virtue has no master, and as a man honors or dishonors her, he will have more or less of her. The responsibility is with the chooser. God is not responsible. So you are responsible for the life you choose. So saying, the prophet scattered lots indifferently among them all, and each of them took up the lot which fell near him. Next, the prophet placed on the ground in front of them sample lives, of which there were far more than there were souls in the crowd. And when he had spoken, he who had the first choice came forward and straightway chose the greatest tyranny. So didn't think, just chose. Instead of throwing the blame of his misfortune on himself, he accused chance and the diamonds and everything rather than himself. And owing to this inexperience of theirs, and also because of the chance of the lot, many of the souls exchanged a good destiny for an evil one, or an evil for a good. And now when all the souls had chosen their lives, they approached Lachesis in the order that the lottery had assigned them, and she sent with him the daimon whom they had chosen to be the guardian of their lives and the fulfiller of the choice. This daimon led the souls first to Clotho, and drew them within the revolution of the spindle impelled by her hand, thus ratifying the destiny of each. And then, when they were fastened to this, carried them to Atropos, who spun the threads and made them irreversible, whence, without turning round, they passed beneath the throne of necessity. So that's the relevant part of the myth of as you will see, it's going to become rather important in the story that I'm going to be telling you. So that is a very important dialogue for the concept of fate and lives, and thus in astrology, which is supposed to be showing your life on a piece of paper. We also have the Stoics, who were very big into astrology, especially people like Quintus Cicero in De Divinatione, which the cosmology, magic, and divination people have just written an essay, some of them have written an essay about, which was based largely on Posidonius, also a big fan of astrology, who says divine providence provides signs of future events. And the world is set up in such a way that certain things are preceded by certain signs, including those from the stars. And this kind of thinking combines with the Aristotelian universe and physical causation and things like elements and qualities and how the cosmos is ordered. And this philosophy is more or less following Greek ideas of human fate. And determinism, and I say determinism of various strengths here, but some kind of determinism being associated with astrology. And just for the sake of definition here, I will say that determinism means that every event follows from a cause and the necessary consequence of antecedent states of affairs. So if you do one thing, there's going to be a resultant cause because of that. Now, this determinism can also, in terms of astrology, slide into what I'm calling fatalism, a fatalistic view, and especially among opponents of astrology, who would much prefer to think of astrology giving you some kind of inexorable fate about which you can do nothing. And especially by the Christians. They were very keen on ascribing fatalism to astrology. So that, and by fatalism I mean that all events are predetermined and inevitable, and there's nothing you can do about it. Just, you have your fate, that's it. No recourse. But let's look at this a little bit more closely, and we'll start with the Aristotelian view of the world in relation to astrology. And here I'll give you a quote of David Pingree that describes this Aristotelian universe in relationship to astrology. He says, sometime in the late 2nd or early 1st century BC, someone, perhaps in Egypt, invented genethliological astrology, which assumes an Aristotelian universe in which the Earth is at the center, consisting of the 4 sublunar elements, surrounded by the eternally circling spheres of the 7 planets in the so-called Hellenistic order. Thus, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, which Chris has already said is the Chaldean order, but sometimes you start with Saturn. So Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon. Now, along with the Aristotelian cosmos, there is a view that astrology is the chief component of a deterministic life for humans. And this is the physical universe, and astrology then becomes associated with our physical life on Earth. Planets and stars as physical bodies give either causes or signs of this life. So, what is in the birth chart then determines one's physical life on Earth. The components of the birth chart predict circumstances that cannot be changed, physical circumstances that cannot be changed. And so knowing the birth chart and what it means for one's life gives a forewarning of events to come and the space to find peace of mind. And here we see what astrologers say about this. And I've given you 2 quotes here, one from Ptolemy, one from Vettius Valens. The Ptolemy one is quite a Stoic view. For first, one must consider that even for the events that result from necessity, and remember we heard about necessity quite a lot in the myth of and the assignment of lives, the choosing of lives. The unexpected is very apt to produce both deranged confusion and delirious joy, excessive joy. But foreknowing accustoms and composes the soul. So we don't want, extremes of emotion. We want even. So if you know what's going to happen in advance, you can calm yourself down, kind of like the Brexit vote. We're all in that state of either deranged confusion or excessive joy at the moment. But Ptolemy says if we know what's going to happen to us in advance, we can can get ourselves back on an even keel. And then Verius Valens says, those who have engaged themselves with foreknowledge of the future and the truth acquire a soul unenslaved and free. They bear steadfastly the decrees of fate and stand firm as soldiers of fate. So they accept what fate has given you, and basically Valens has said, no good fighting against fate, because it is what it is, and what you have to do is bear it steadfastly and stand firm as a soldier of fate. So these views could be characterized as deterministic, but opponents of astrology went further. Astrology is not just deterministic, but fatalistic. Nothing is up to us. We have no control. There's no free will. People like Carneades attack astrology and assume it's fatalistic. People like Panetius and Favorinus and Sextus Empiricus, and the Christians especially, like to characterize astrology as fatalistic and denying free will. So the upshot sort of default position that sort of comes to be common in the culture, late antique culture, is that astrology is a carrier of fatalism. So at this point, I think we need to define some terms for the next part of the discussion. And so, because we're going to be talking about components of fate. So the first word that I want to talk about is hemarmene. That is physical fate. Okay? It literally means that which has been allotted. And it comes from the Greek word merimai, and this is the same root as Moira, or the Moirai, the fates that we saw mentioned in the myth of Ur, Lachesis, Clotho, and Atropos. Okay? It is often translated as fate or destiny, and it is usually applied to physical fate, and often linked to necessity. And we saw these links again. We saw in the myth of Ur these links to necessity. So fate and necessity have a connection with each other. But we also have something called pronoia. And in English, this is usually translated as providence, although literally in Greek, it means foreknowing. Providence is actually coming, which means foresight, is actually coming from the Latin, providere. So providence now can also have two senses. It can mean an overarching order in the cosmos, or it can mean a divine intervention. And it has both of these senses in antiquity. So providence as a divine intervention changing the course of events that would otherwise follow. And this is going to be a very important concept for getting out of the determinism that gets ascribed to astrology. So these are also components of astrology, both hemarmene and pronoia. We saw in a couple of previous slides that Valens talked about being a steadfast soldier of fate. He's also a big fan of providence. And he says, I entreat you, he swears by the stars, providence, and necessity. He says, I entreat you, my most honored brother, and those being initiated into the mysteries, and by the mysteries he means learning astrology, with this composition, his book on astrology, by the starry vault of heaven in the 12-fold zodiacal circle, by both the sun and the moon and the 5 wandering stars through which all life is driven, by both providence itself and holy necessity to keep these things in secret. Okay, he swears by the sun and the moon and the planets, and he swears by providence and necessity. So these are very, very important things for him. And if we know that providence can play a role in astrology. This can lead us to some ways to get around the effects of fate, the effects of Hemarmene, especially using this concept of providence. And we're going to see this with Valens as an example. And so I'm going to call this next part Cracks in the Armor of Fate. And I'm going to be talking about these different topics. A dialogue, or an essay from Middle Platonism called De Fato on Fate. Its Greek name is Hemarmenes. A section on Neoplatonism, particularly talking about Porphyry, who was not only a Neoplatonic philosopher but an astrologer. He wrote a book on astrology, and he was very interested in the relationship of astrology to fate. We're also going to look at a couple of magical papyri, which show you ways to change your fate. And we're also going to look at some other fate traditions aside from the Greek one. So let's start with De Fato, Middle Platonism. Okay. Now, in this essay, there are 3 levels of fate. I'll show you those in a minute. But Hemarmene here is defined as energeia, which means activity, and as ousia, which means being or essence or substance or existence. And Hemarmene is an activity, as an activity is defined as a law. Remember we saw Valens talking about the laws of fate? It's a divine logos. It's a law which determines, quote, the linking of future events to events past and present. So this is, again, a little reference back to the Republic and the 3 fates being in charge of the past, the present, and the future. The SES says, fate, according to its being, seems to be the entire soul of the cosmos divided into 3. Into a non-wandering portion of fate, a portion called wandering, and a third portion below the heavens which concerns the earth, of which the highest is called Clotho, the one after that Atropos, and the lowest Lachesis, who receives the heavenly activities of her sisters, interweaving and distributing them to the terrestrial regions appointed to her. And here is a little diagram so that you can see this. So you have, if we think of fate as being a large circle, we have sort of 3 divisions of that circle. The non-wandering portion ruled by Clotho. She is the ruler of the highest part of Hemarmene. The non-wandering part, certainly this suggests the fixed stars. I'm sure that when I said this, everybody thought, oh, fixed stars. And primary or diurnal motion in which the stars and planets move in a regular way. That is not wandering, which would include things like what the planets do, where they seem to move forward and backward and stop and go slow and go fast. And diurnal motion, which goes from east to west every day. Atropos, the cutter, is in the middle, the wandering portion, the planets, though paradoxically, Atropos herself is called the unturnable. That's Walter Burkhart's translation. And wandering obviously suggests the planets. A planet is literally a wanderer. And the planets also move in a direction in the order of the zodiac, moving from west to east, the opposite of diurnal motion. So, as responsible for the second level of Hemarmene, do the planets then become bearers of an allotment for humans from which there is no turning back? So are you, when you get your natal chart, are the planets in there your allotment, so to speak? And there's nothing you can do about that. You get what you get. Now, Lachesis, the apportioner, is the lowest part of fate, who takes the parts generated by the other 2 moirai and makes them available to the human realm. and she's in charge of the earth, with how fate actually comes down to the human realm, and Lachesis distributes the thread in its final cut of Hamarmene to humans, and she receives the activities, the fate activities of her sisters. So this is substantial or existential Hamarmene, and we could call this allotment in the physical world. It's connected with time and cycles, and it sounds like the essayist is saying that astrology can show Hamarmene, because he's talking about things in the heavens, and that this is some kind of astral determinism. But the essayist also says this: be it noted, however, to make our present situation clear, that my writing these words at the moment as I write them, and you're doing what you happen to be doing as you happen to be doing it, are not events brought about by the agency of the heavenly bodies alone as causes of everything. Okay, so it's not only that. This movement of the heavenly bodies is then not the only cause of everything, which leads us to the second part of De Fato, which moves from fate to providence, from Hamarmene to pronoia. So just to remind you, you have in providence, you have 3 levels also. They are above fate, and providence can supersede Hamarmene. So you have a primary, a secondary, and a tertiary providence. And there's a little diagram of that. So how does fate stand in relation to providence? Though all is contained in fate, not everything conforms to fate. So pronoia can supersede Hamarmene. Okay? So I'm going to show you another chart that shows how that all works together. But first we've got the primary or highest providence, begets fate and includes it. Okay? The secondary providence is the gods in heaven. Again, this might be associated with some kind of planetary movement. And then you have tertiary providence, which is within fate, and it is begotten later than fate and contained in it in the same way as power and chance are said to be contained in fate. And in tertiary providence, this is where we have guarding and interpreting daimons, who are operating in, though not entirely conforming to, a Hamarmene of planets and stars. Okay. So this is just to show you how these things are all situated within each other. The essayist says, and whereas fate most certainly conforms to providence, providence most certainly does not conform to fate. Though secondary and tertiary providence must conform to fate, primary providence is at least superior to Hamarmene and can supersede it. So all fate, therefore, conforms to primary providence. And so that's why I've put in this diagram, primary providence is not only containing secondary providence, but it's also containing fate, and within fate we find tertiary providence. I know this seems very complicated, but there is a point to this. So, if all fate is conforming to primary providence, and all 3 kinds of fate, the non-wandering, the wandering, and the earthly, can then be superseded by providence, there's always the possibility for the good to prevail. There's always the possibility of some kind of intervention, presumably because of the benevolence of the deity who is in charge of primary providence, because primary providence is called the realm of the primary and beneficent God. Okay? So providence is the out, basically. All right. So what can we say about this in terms of astrology? The essayist says, fate then includes everything that comes to be. And that implies at least there's something prior to fate, before what comes to be. If fate is everything that comes to be, then it is tied to the material world of generation, the process of becoming into being. And that leaves a place for pronoia, which must anticipate what comes to be before it comes to be. And then, in pronoia, in providence, we, or at least God, do have options. Subject, like everything else, to primary providence, astrology can determine some kinds of fate, but not every bit of fate, possibly because it's working in the realm of the particular and not the universal. So you've got, and within this, this constellation of primary providence and fate within providence, you have tertiary providence within fate, which I am arguing, and remember that tertiary providence is associated with the daimon, and we had the idea of this guardian daimon in the myth of who comes with you to ratify the life that you've chosen. So this is the providence that I am going to argue that Thaddeus Valens is referring to, with his emphasis on a personal daimon who allowed him to find astrology, and his urging that one follow the daimon as it wills. So let's go back to Valens and his thoughts on fate, but now we'll look at what he thinks about providence as well. Okay, so here's what he says about fate. Just as a slave who in his intelligence knows the habits of a bad master and makes provisions regularly for these behaviors in daily life and does not set himself against the arrangement of the one who makes the orders, he considers his existence without pain and tireless, and in the same manner, I myself have made the service neither wretched nor painful, but in releasing myself from every vain hope and care, I have carefully kept the law of Hamarmene. So he's come to a certain point of release and a certain point of being then without pain, because he's accepted the parts of his fate that there's nothing he can do anything about. When he says, I've carefully kept the law of Hamarmene, and we've seen the law of Hamarmene mentioned in this essay, this Middle Platonic essay on fate. This suggests, actually, because Valens is living in that same time period, he's more or less contemporary with this. This suggests that he was familiar with the principles of Hamarmene that are outlined in that essay, although we cannot prove that he read it. But, you know, these ideas tend to float around in the zeitgeist, and, you know, even if he hadn't read that particular essay, he might have heard it from something else. The ideas were out there. So he says, I myself, having learned about myself from foreknowledge, prognosis, claimed such a foundational chart as my lot. Okay, this is what I was given, this is what I came in with. And within this parameter, it is not possible to become something different, able to obtain what the daimonian did not wish to provide. And the daimonian is the way he is speaking about the daimon. And he did think he had a daimon. He thought he had a personal daimon. And he talks about it in his astrology book. He says, in fact, he says it was his daimon who led him to astrology. He says, we kept on experimenting until the wished-for daimonian, through a certain providence, made the transmission of astrological knowledge. So it was his daimon working through providence who gave him the right teacher of astrology, because he was wandering around Egypt apparently searching for the right teacher to teach him astrology. And he says, and it came to me through my daimon, through a certain providence. So he's associating the daimon with providence. And we've seen in the essay on fate that the third level of providence is associated with the daimon. So my argument is that this is what Valens is talking about here. Yes, and in De Fato, the essayist says we must posit that the encouragement given to association with certain persons by the daimonion conforms to tertiary providence. So it says it right out. With certain persons, while their immediate and rapid progress conforms to fate, and the whole complex is plainly enough none other than a form of fate. So this actually is kind of more of an illustration of this diagram of tertiary providence with the daimon being in fate and being able to supersede certain kinds of fate. And that, I think, is what Valens is also talking about. So Valens, the presumed determinist, the soldier of fate, right, seems to be following this third level of fate and providence. And he has said the wished for daimonion, which makes you wonder if he's had this kind of experience before, and that it's the daimon who grants this through a certain providence. So maybe this is not the only time that he's been given some kind of providential something by what he's calling his personal daimon. And he then says, at another part in his book, I was thought fit by God and providence to light upon a secure and safe harbor. And then he says, talking about astrology, for I have not made the words for the uninitiated, but for the ones clever at such things as they follow with acuity the manifold and intricate part of the theory through many ways, both ins and outs. In learning to know these things, in learning astrology, they will seem to associate with gods. So for him, learning astrology is a way to become closer to the gods, a way to associate with gods. And like the gods, may acquire a measure of pronoia. So a certain amount of pronoia, which the daimon is willing to provide to you if you ask nicely. Okay, that's a lot of stuff. And how are we doing for time?
We've got 5 minutes because we started late. So.
Okay, all right. Well, we're gonna move very quickly. I think I'm gonna go pretty quickly through these next bits of slides, but I think you get the point that providence is a very important part of astrology and the practice of astrology, at least for Vettius Valens. Okay. I'm going to just say very quickly about Porphyry. Porphyry is exceedingly interested in fate and astrology, very interested in the myth of and how astrology and the personal daimon combine in what kind of life we have on Earth. I won't go into that dialogue now. But in a nutshell, he posits a choice of 2 kinds of lives. One is physical and environmental circumstances under which someone is born, which once chosen cannot be changed. That's the fate part. And the other is how we live that life, which is up to us. If we claim our lives are like a sonnet, we have to live within the form of the sonnet, but we can say whatever we want in the sonnet within that form. Okay? And the daimon enforces our choice and also guides us in our life on Earth. So it tries to steer us more on a path of virtue. Okay, in his essay on what is up to us, he discusses the role of astrology as well as what is up to us. And yeah, I think we'll move on because I really want to get to other ideas of fate. Again, I'm going to move very quickly through the magical papyri, which I should point out, these are just some examples of the first one, PGM7, casting a chart for meeting your own personal daimon. So again, combining astrology with the daimon. PDM 14, casting a chart for getting what you wish for. An inquiry addressed to Shai, who's the Egyptian god of fate. And finally, PGM 13, where you can change your fate and change your chart. Now, and I should also point out that the magical papyri are only nominally Greek. Some of them are written in Greek, but some of them are written in Egyptian, and sometimes it's very thinly veiled Egyptian concepts that are being talked about here. So let's talk very quickly a little bit about Egyptian and Mesopotamian fate. Let's skip this for now. Because this is, I think, where some of the ideas or some of the unspoken practices in astrology are coming from. They're coming from not Greek fate, but they're coming from Mesopotamia and Egypt, where fate is not like it is in Greece. Did I skip this? Yeah. So the Mesopotamian word for fate is shibtu, and it means decreeing or ordering or determining. It can shift to mean a destiny decreed by gods to humans or a portion given by the gods, but this destiny is not fixed. It can be negotiated, and the verdict can be appealed. So again, you have possibilities. You're not stuck in a fate once you get it. You can appeal to the gods. And this is similar to the idea of appealing to your daimonian and providence, but here it's very much a part of the Mesopotamian system of communication with the gods. The signs on Earth together with those of the sky give us signals. Sky and Earth both bring us portents, each separately but not different, since sky and Earth are interconnected. So the astrologer finds the omen. If it's bad, can look for extenuating circumstances and suggest appropriate action, for instance, a Namburbu undoing ritual that will get rid of it. And let's see, I'll skip that. And this is just the main points of Mesopotamian fate and astral omena. Let's move to Egypt. So I mentioned this god Shai. The word Shai in Egyptian has a similar semantic feel to Shibtu. It can mean order, decree, determine, or predestine, and it has the force of law. From the Old and Middle Kingdom, it means ordain or command, but in the New Kingdom, we get more explicit ideas of fate, i.e. a life divinely decreed, but again, these decrees can be appealed. Shai becomes associated with length of life, and death is ordained by the gods. Shai is responsible for a fate given at the moment of birth. It's also the name of the demotic 11th place, which is called the good daimon in Hellenistic astrology, but it's called Shai in demotic Egyptian. There are other deities that are associated with birth, like Renenet, who's the goddess of nourishment, and Meskenet, who's the divine midwife. And you can see them here in the Papyrus of Ani from the British Museum. They're all present at the weighing of the heart, which comes at the end of life. So to me, this says that why would all of these birth deities be present at the end of life unless the person who's been given that life had the opportunity to change that life as it went along. So it's not what you are given at birth is not fixed and unchangeable. You can become more virtuous. You can have your heart weigh equally with the Ma'at feather of righteousness and justice. Shepsut is kind of a counterpart to Shai. She's the opposite, the 11th. She's the name of the 5th place, which is called good fortune. And in the Ptolemaic period, Shai actually becomes connected to the Agathos daimon. So again, we have this connection with Daimon. And his consort is Isis, who was also Agathe Taiki. Agathe Taiki is the 5th, Agathos daimon is the 11th. So we have all of these ideas coming into Hellenistic astrology, but they're not necessarily written about, they're just sitting there. Okay, and Isis is also a fate goddess. And she had a huge, huge cult in the Greco-Roman period. And is given control over fate. In a hymn to Isis, she's called Wealth Giver, Queen of the Gods, Queen Hermuthis, Almighty, Agathoteke, renowned Isis, inventor of all life. She has control over the pharaoh's life. She opens the year on his birthday, which is favorable for your Shai, for your fate, favorable for your Shepset. She says she has control over astronomy. I separated Earth from heaven. I pointed out the paths of the stars. I arranged the courses of the sun and moon. I accompanied the course of the sun. I set down laws for men. I made the just strong. With me, the just. Whatever I determine this too is accomplished. For me, everything gives way. Okay, I'm in charge. I can conquer fate. Fate obeys me. And if you ask me nicely, I'll change your fate as well. Okay? So I know I'm going really quickly through this, but I want you all to see how different this is from the Greek concept, and how all of these things are also present, if not explicitly discussed in Greek astrology. Finally, in the Metamorphoses of Apuleius, she says, if by assiduous obedience, worshipful service, and steadfast celibacy, you win the favor of my divine acquiescence, you will know that I, and I alone, can even prolong your life beyond the limits established by your fate. So Isis is capable of changing fate as well. And that is it. So thank you very much.
I've got questions for this afternoon. Just very quickly, because we've got to go to the tea break.
Yes.
Did you look at Chalcidius in this model, or is he a little too late?
I have looked at Chalcidius, but I have not brought him into this because there's just so much.
Would you say he was too late for the influence on Hellenistic astrology?
Not necessarily.
Because he's right on that.
And but he's saying, I mean, there's
he's saying a very different. No, it's a different model, I think.
Yeah, but in terms of Plato.
Yes. He's trying to reduce the Stoic influence.
Yes.
Bring that,
Yes.
Anyway,
yes.
I just wanted to check how you saw it.
One thing.
Yeah.
I'm interested. Colossus taught astrology on the island of Kos.
Yeah.
Chaldean astrology. Was that pre-Plato or after? I don't know my dates.
I think it's after.
After. It was after, was it?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Jose
Jose.
is bounding his chair.
Yeah. The essay de facto is Cicero's.
No. It's pseudo-Plutarch.
Okay.
It's
But
pseudo-Plutarch.
okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I should have pointed that out. It's not Cicero's essay on fate. Lots of people wrote essays on fate.
Yeah.
This is ascribed to Plutarch, but it is not genuine Plutarch.
And one more question. Do you consider all this influence between philosophy and astrology, how it is looked at the beginnings of astrology in the 2nd century, as Springer is saying? Do you think that astrology is influencing philosophy, or philosophy is influencing astrology, or is after?
I think, I think some basic concepts of astrology are coming out of various philosophies, but they're also coming out of these other cultures from Mesopotamia and Egypt. And I also think that as we go on, we have cross-pollination, if you know what I mean.
Which is still continuing.
Which is still continuing.
In the astrological community.
Right. So it's not a one-way street, really, because you're always going to have reaction to ideas, and ideas are going to be exchanged, and that's going to lead to other things. Yeah.
Okay, let's have a, because you can keep